Now that we've covered the reading part of setting up a CRUD system here with our colors, basically our index and our show pages, let's move on and take a look at the next piece, which will be the ability to be able to create colors. This is actually something that we've already done part of the work for back when we were first talking about using the fWrite statement. We set up a simple little form that let us fill in the data about a color and then write that color out to the file. This is essentially the file that we had. I've simply renamed it new. I believe before the file was called writing colors or color writer or something along those lines. But here's essentially what we have. We have a form that submits back to itself, so it's a self-submitting page. It submits the data with post, and what I have is I have fields for the user to be able to submit the color's name, and then separate fields for them to be able to submit the red value, the green value, and the blue value. Up above that form, what I had in here was a simple rudimentary ability to be able to display error messages to the user. When we put this in originally, the only error message we were actually generating was if we were unable to write to the file, but we're going to need to expand on that a little bit in this example. But you can see essentially what we have here is we have a statement that checks an errors array, and if there's more than 0 errors in that array, we output a div that has an ID of error explanation that goes along with my CSS. I have a little header in there that says this color could not be saved for the following reasons, and then we have a little for each loop which just goes through and displays all the messages that are actually in the error array. Up above that then at the top of this file we have where the actual PHP code that does the work of actually saving this color. We have the actual error array itself where we'll save any error messages that we come across so that they can be then displayed down in the body. Then here, kind of the key, one of the big keys to this script is this big if statement. This if statement checks to see if a color name, red value, green value, and blue value are set in the post array. Essentially that statement is saying if the form has been submitted. If that if statement is true and the form has been submitted, then inside the if we go through the process of actually writing the data out to the file. If the data hasn't been submitted, that matches us up with this closing curly brace right down here on line 20, which essentially means that PHP doesn't do anything. So if no data has been submitted, then PHP just sort of steps out of the way and it becomes essentially just a regular old HTML page, letting the user just see the form which they can complete. Now, looking at the situation where what happens if the form has been submitted, what we do is we open a file, our file in append mode. If the file was actually opened, then what we do is we put together our output string, which is the color name, red value, green value, and blue value separated by tabs. We then write that output to our file and we close the file. Now, the way we wrote this before, it was a fine demonstration of how to use the fWrite statement, but there's definitely a few things this time through on this pass that we're going to want to change. One of those things that I see that definitely needs to be changed is that the output that we're writing does not include the ID number. Since the last time we visited this file, we came to the decision that our colors all needed to be identified with ID numbers. We saw the need for those when we put together our show page, and that need for those IDs is going to turn up even more when we attempt to be able to edit or destroy different colors that are in our file. So we're definitely going to have to find a way to integrate that ID number into the line that's being written out to our file. Another thing that is very, very much missing here is any type of validation. At the moment, we're not doing anything to check to see that the data that the user is submitting is valid. Now, at this point in the class, I don't want to get too in-depth into the validation, making sure that the color codes are actually valid hexadecimal values, for example, but we could at least do some basic rudimentary validation, doing things like just making sure that the name and those color values aren't blank. Right now, even just that would be pretty sufficient. So let's take a look at how we'll do those things. Let's start off with just how do we get that ID available to us in the new color that's going to be written to the file. Essentially the way it works, the way we're going to have to go about this right now, is that the only way we can really tell what ID to write with a new color that's being created is for us to actually look at all of the IDs that are already available, and then based on the last ID we find, go up by 1. So that we know that we will not be stepping on an ID that's already available in that file and that the IDs will themselves remain unique. So the first thing I really need to do in here is I need to actually read all of my colors from the file so that I can then examine their IDs. We read all the colors from the file back on the index page and back on the show page. So I'm going to go back over to my show page, and again, even though it makes the skin crawl just a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the code that we wrote over on the show page that we use to actually read from the file. Let me go ahead and paste that in here, and I'll comment it real quick so we'll know what it is. There we go. There's a little bit of code in here that we don't actually need. This bit here where we're getting the selected color, that was something that was being done very specifically for the show page. The new page shouldn't need to do that. What we're left with instead is we are looking at our opening our file, and then if the file opens properly, we go through the process of reading it, breaking it down into associative arrays, which are then stored in a master array. That master array is supposed to be called colors. Here it is used right here. I need to actually declare that array. So back up here at the top, let me throw that in. And with that color array, right, hopefully this code should go on and work. One other little change I might make is that when we first created our new page, we had declared the file name that was being used here in a variable. I could use that here in both of these segments, the segment where I write and the segment where I read. So let me move that variable back up here before it, and I'll reference it here in the first fopen. And that ought to basically take care of the process of actually loading the data in from the file. This comment's a bit out of place, isn't it? All right, so now I have my file name. I have a segment of code that actually reads all my colors from my file, and then I have a segment of code down here that's going to be responsible for writing the data back to the file. Somewhere between where I actually read the data from the file and when I start writing to the file is where I'm actually going to need to determine what the ID to be used is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it last ID, and I'm going to initialize that to 0. Then what I essentially want to do is I want to loop through all of the colors that we've read from our file, and with each one of those colors I want to look at its ID, and if its ID is bigger than what I have as my last ID, I will store it as such. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to say for each of the colors that I have, taking each one as, I'll just say color, again careful with variable names that are that similar. For each one of those colors I'm going to say if that particular color's ID, if it's greater than what I have stored as the last ID, then I'm going to set that color's ID as my new last ID. Basic idea being that when this for loop ends, what should happen is the last ID variable should then have the highest numerical ID stored in it. So essentially we start off with last ID 0. If we then start looping through our array and we find a color that has an ID of 1, 1 is bigger than 0, so 1 becomes the new last ID. We continue going through our colors like that. If we find a color that has an ID of 20, 20 is bigger than 1, so 20 would become the value of last ID. So by the time that entire thing is through, last ID should have stored in it the last currently used ID. So then if I go 1 past that number, that should give me a safe ID to use for my new color. So let me come down here to this fwrite statement, and for the fwrite statement what I'm going to do is I am going to pre-increment last ID, forgot my $sign there, and I will append it in with the rest of the data, separating it with a tab, just like I did everything else. So if the last ID is found to be 20, I'll add one more to it. 21 is what I'll get. That 21 is then what will be written out as the ID for this new color. Let's take a look at that and see if it actually works. For starters, here's the way that my actual color file looks at the moment. The very last color I have in here is Blue Jay White, and it has an ID of 10. Let's jump over to the browser and see about creating a new color. All right, here in the browser, I'm actually at sort of the home page of my little system. I'm going to click on my link to go to the new page. Everything's there is looking fine right now. Let me create the color red. I'm going to put in the values FF0000, and when I hit save, the form blanks out, which is itself a little bit of a usability problem, but let's see what actually happened in our color file. Here in my color file, I can see that what's happened now is my new color, red, has been created with the proper color codes, and it's been given the ID of 11. Let's give it one more try. Back over on the color page again on the browser, let's create the color blue. I'll give it the value of 0000FF, and when I create that one, there we are. And looking at the color file again, it looks like blue was created and it now has an ID of 12. So it appears that our scheme to be able to write colors out to our file with IDs is working just fine. So that little part of the update we needed to make to our new page seems to be working fine. The other little update that we really need to make is concerning validation. Now, like I mentioned before with the validation, I don't particularly want to get too in-depth into it, but I would at least like to make sure that we're not writing any blank colors, any blank lines out to our file. I want to make sure there's at least some value in all four of the different fields in our form. So where would be the appropriate place for us to put that validation? Probably what I'd like to do is I'd like to validate only when data has been submitted, so that would put me inside this if statement, but most likely before I go through and do any of this other work. There's no point in me actually opening my file, there's no point in finding the next ID, there's no point in anything else inside this if statement if the data we have is not actually valid. So how about I jump down in here, and I'll put my validation right around this point. Here we are. To actually do the validation, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a series of different variables to hold my values. So I'm going to create a variable for the color name, create a variable for each one of the different color values, something like this. So I have 4 variables to hold the 4 different values that should be coming from my form, and I've initialized each one of the 4 of them to blank. What I'm then going to do with those first is I'm actually going to jump back down to the form itself, and I want to make sure that if the user fills in the form, whatever value they submitted previously will still show up in those fields. So the idea is if the user gives a name but they don't put in a red, green, or blue value, when they submit the form, the color shouldn't be created. But when the user is taken back to the form again, the name they put, the correct part they did, should still be there. So the user is never forced to redo any work that they've done previously. What I can do is I can take those variables I just declared up at the top, and now in these value attributes for my actual form fields, I can echo out those values. So I'll echo the color name variable's value there as the value of the color name field, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the 3 color fields. There, with those echoes put in place in the value attributes of my 4 fields, now whatever is in those 4 variables should always appear in the fields whenever the form is shown. When the page is first submitted, assuming that we haven't gotten to that if statement or assuming that the form hasn't been submitted, because these 4 values start off blank, the fields on my form will start off blank. If there were any default values I wanted to put into those fields for the user, I could go ahead and fill those into the variables, and that would take care of it for me. Part of the reason I like to handle it this way. The next part of the trick then is that what I need to do is I need to make sure that any value the user does submit actually ends up getting put into those variables. So what I'm going to put as the very first line here inside this if statement is an extract statement. With the extract statement, I'm going to tell it to extract data from the post array, but only extract if exists, which I believe we've covered in a different video. If I'm misremembering that, then you might want to simply look up this extract function in the PHP documentation. I can tell you real quickly that essentially what it does is that it will pull values out of an associative array. So the post array is an associative array. It has stored in it values kind of like what we see here, right? Say post color name, for example. And what the extract function will do is it will see that in the post array there's something called color name. It will then, because of this extract if exists, look to see if a variable of that same name exists. So essentially color name as a key in the post array will equate to color name as a variable here in my program. The extract function will use that information to match up those two things, and it will then take the value out of the post array and automatically put it there into my variable. I could do that sort of more by hand if I wanted to. I could say if is set $_post color name, and then if that was true, I could say $color name, my local variable, equals $post color name. So take the value out. And I would have to do that then for all 4 of those variables. The extract function is just a much faster way to do it. With that little bit in there, what it essentially means is that now if I submit the form, the values that the user submitted, the values in the post array, will be put into my variables. And since just previously I put my variable values back into the fields, that should mean now that if I try to submit the form, it will refill the form with any data that still appears there. Let's go give that a try. Back over in the browser, let me go ahead and reload my page. There we are. And now if I fill in a new color, let's do green. There we are. When I submit the form now, the data stays right there in the form. The form doesn't blank out again. Now in the end result for this particular page, I actually don't want the user after they create a new color to still see this page. I'd rather redirect them somewhere else. Just leaving them sitting here staring at the form, I imagine would make most users question as to whether submitting the form had actually done anything or not. There's no message, there's no indication of success. So in the end result, we won't leave the user sitting here staring at a filled in form, but where this will become beneficial is when we kick into our validation here. Because if there is a problem when we do keep the user here at the form, they won't have to repeat any of the inputs that they had done previously. Back over in the code now, let's go ahead and take a look at doing the actual validation. The validation itself, like I said, doesn't have to be all that complicated right now. Really all I want to do is make sure that real values have been submitted. Those real values at this point should be present here in these variables, so I just really want to check and see if those variables are empty or not. I could do that with a series of if statements. So I'll start by saying if empty color name. Right? So essentially if they submitted a blank color name, this variable now is the value that was submitted, then really what I want to do is I want to record an error about it. There are different ways I could potentially record that error. I certainly have this errors array already set up and ready to go. I could create a string error message and simply push it into that array, so the errors array would essentially be numerically indexed, but I think it'll be worth my while if I spend a little bit of time making sure that I'll actually be able to tell which fields have errors. So instead of just doing an array push to push a string into the errors array, let me store a string in the errors array based on field name, using the field name as the key. So here's what I'm thinking. Into the errors array, inside a key called color name, because the color name field is the field that we're having supposedly a problem with right here, I'll store a message saying the color's name cannot be blank. Just as easy as that. Like I was saying, I could have just pushed that message into this array, but actually storing that message under color name means that later I'll be able to come back and do an isSet for the color name key in the errors array, which will let me determine if there's actually a problem with the color name specifically. So let me take that same general idea and let's do it for the other four fields as well. All right, something like this is what I have in mind. Right? Essentially the same four if statements, four if statements that are essentially the same. It's just each one is checking a slightly different value. So one to check the color name and then one each for the red, green, and blue values. Okay. That should essentially take care of my validation. The next little trick though is that if the color does not pass validation, if the data submitted does not pass validation, then at that point I do not want to go on and actually read from the file to get the ID and then write to the file. I only want to do that if the color is complete, if we have no validation problems. So let me put another if statement in here. I'm going to say if the count of the errors that we found, if it is equal to 0, there we are. So if we found 0 errors, then I want to go ahead and read all the data from the file, find the next ID, and then write the new data back out to the file. So let me take all of that and put it inside that if statement. So essentially here, this is the end of the validation if, which is the errors equal to 0 message. All right, so if there are any validation errors, essentially we'll end up here at the end of that if statement. At the end of that if statement, since there's really no other PHP code that executes, again, this will essentially just be a regular old HTML page. So let's give that a try and see how that works. Back over in the browser, I'm going to go ahead and reload the page from scratch. Maybe we should take a look at our colors file real quick first. So here's the way the colors file looks right now. The last color that was created was green with an ID of 13. Let's try adding another color, but let's leave the data invalid and see if it stops it. So in the browser, I'll go ahead and just try submitting a completely blank color. It looks good so far, right? I see my nice error messages appeared up here at the top telling me my name, red, green, and blue values can't be blank. And if I look over in my data file, it looks like green is still the last one, so the validation I put in indeed did stop an invalid color from being submitted. Let's try some partially completed forms. Here in the browser, if I provide a name but nothing else, the name stays in place. That's what I was hoping for before with that extract statement. The form still doesn't submit though. If I put in a green value, The error messages are going away for all of the fields that are correctly being filled, but any field that is still blank is getting no values in it. So it looks like this is all working just fine. Let's make sure that we actually can still create a color. Let's go ahead and create the color black since I'm most of the way there already. If I go ahead and hit submit, we're still staying on the page, which is still something that needs to be addressed. But if I go over and look at my data file now, there we go. Black was actually created with ID 14. So I think we've got our validation working real well right now. Okay, so at that point we have our validation working and we have it creating the ID for us the way that we had intended. Those were the two major things that we wanted to work on. There are still, though, a few usability issues in here that I might like to address. One of them has to do with validation itself. And that's that when we do actually have a validation error, besides just showing the user the error message up at the top, it might be nice to somehow highlight or indicate the field itself. Let's see if we could do that. So if, for example, here when the green value is invalid, I might like a red border to appear around that particular field. Back over in the code, that should then be pretty easy to handle at this point. And part of what will make it relatively easy to handle is the fact that when I stored my error messages from validation in my array, I saved them based on the actual name of the field. I could then check on the names of those fields down below and use that to determine whether I wanted to show them with a red border or not. The red border itself could actually be achieved by using CSS, and I already have the CSS set up for that. Really what I want to do is I want to put in class error field, something like that, which then in my browser will cause it to highlight that particular field. Except, of course, I don't want to do this all the time, right? I only want to do it when a field actually has a problem. So I could do that by putting an if statement with each one of these opening paragraph tags that checks for that particular field's name in the errors array. Okay, an if statement, something like this, where I'm checking to see if we do have something called color name inside the errors array. If we actually do, then what I would want to do is I'd want to display that opening paragraph tag, but I would want to do it with the error field class assigned to it, since we know that there is actually an error that goes along with that particular field. If there is no actual error that goes along with that field, then what I would do in that case is just display a regular paragraph mark. Let's just take a look real quick and see if that works. Over in the browser, if I reload my page, oops, it looks like I made a mistake somewhere. Line 146. 146 is actually off the end of the page. Oh, I already see what it is that I did here. I put the PHP tags in for it, but I never actually put in the end if. That's usually the case when it labels the very last of your script as being an error. You've usually forgotten a bracket or a brace or a quote or to close a control structure like an end if. Let's give that another try in the browser. There we go. Now, if when I first come to the page, I have no problem with the name field. If I try to save at this point, it does highlight the name field. If I put something into the name field, the highlight goes away because it no longer has a problem. So that basic logic seems to work. I would just need to go through and do that for my other fields as well. Potentially, though, something maybe I could do to save myself a little bit of time would be, instead of having to repeat that if-else if for all four fields, is that maybe I could replace this entire form with a loop where I determine maybe from an array of field names exactly what it is that I want to create here. Here's kind of what I'm thinking is maybe way back up at the top, I could create a new array for myself. There we are, a new array, something like that. And then what I could do with this is that I could maybe fill it with the names of the different fields that I actually want to look at. So I could say I have a field called color name, and then the same thing for the three color fields, red value, green value, and blue value. All right. Having that array available, that would then potentially give me the option of looping through some different things in different places. I could actually, down here in the body, instead of having to go through and do that if-else for all four fields, I could potentially replace almost the entire content of this form with one big loop. I could do something along the lines of putting in a for each loop. And I could say for each of my field names, the array I just created, taking each one of them and calling it name. Then inside that particular for each, I could essentially go through and duplicate what I had done for an individual field. So here inside the for each, the basic idea would be starting off with a if statement. The if statement would be very much like what I had just a minute ago, where I'm looking at my errors array. But instead of checking for a specific name here inside the errors array, what I could do is I could check for the current value that's being given to me by the for each loop. So on the first pass it would be color name, on the second pass it would be red value, then green value the time after that. So instead of having to write this entire thing 4 times, I can get it done by just writing it once here inside this loop. So let me go ahead and finish off this if statement. And whenever we do find an error in a field of a particular name, then we'll label that particular field as being an error field to get our highlighting. Whenever we don't find it in the array, we will just give it a regular opening paragraph mark. There we go, and I'll go ahead and close my paragraph tag. Inside that paragraph then, this is where I would normally put in my label and fields. Let me go ahead and do that. So here's my label, here's my field. The actual specifics that would be filled in here is that the label would basically have the same name as the field. So I would put in an echo for the field's name. That field's name, whichever one we're dealing with in the loop, would also then be the ID of the input field. So that's what I would also put in for the for of the label. I can go ahead and put it in as the ID of the field. I can go ahead and put it in as the name of the field. For the actual value of the field, what I need to do is I need to not echo the name, but I actually need to get a variable that has the same name as the value of the name variable. To do that, I could use variables. So essentially, $name would be something like color name. The extra $sign in front of it then would make it $color name. So it would be really just like what I was doing down here before, when I was just saying $color name, except now the color name part, the actual, if you want to think of it as the sort of the literal variable name, if that's not too much of a conflict, the actual literal variable name there itself is actually now coming from $name, that particular variable. So we could see if that works. This won't be especially pretty. There's a little bit of formatting that we aren't exactly prepared to do yet, but this might at least kind of get us heading in the right direction. So let me go ahead and get rid of all the hard-coded HTML out of there. Basically all replaced here with this for each loop, which will go through and generate those 4 fields for me, including some of the dynamic work like trying to decide if the field has an error and filling the value back into it. Let's try it out in the browser. Back over in the browser, let me load the page from scratch. You can see one of the first concessions that I've had to make doing it this way is that my labels are not as pretty. Where I had them written out nicely before in kind of a human readable format, now they look much more technical. Later when we talk about strings though, it'll be a pretty easy thing for us to come back and be able to fix that up. That won't be too much of a problem. If I actually try to submit the form, there we are. I get all my errors and it's now highlighting all of those fields, which was a behavior we didn't have before. If I start filling in fields, as I submit, you see only the fields with errors have error messages for them and get highlighted. Everything else looks okay. So let's try putting in a real color here. Make sure everything still creates properly. There we are. Let me jump back over to the home page. And down here at the bottom, we should be able to see some of these new colors we've created. Red, blue, green, black, and now yellow. So in general, it actually looks like things are going pretty well. What else do we have to do as far as usability is concerned? Well, I would say one of the last major concerns, one of the last usability issues that I see is that whenever a new color is created, the user is still left sitting here staring at this form. What I would actually prefer would be that whenever the user actually creates a new color, that after that color is created, maybe they would be taken to the show page for that particular color. So they would end up here after creating a color, which I think would be, from a usability point of view, a very good indication to the user that their color creation has succeeded. So if I wanted to be able to redirect the user over to the show page whenever a new color has been successfully created, we would be talking about doing that action right around here somewhere, right? Up here in the head section, or above the head section at the top of the document, this is where I've opened my file, where I've written the new color. There's writing the new color and then close the file. Once the file's closed, at that point we would essentially consider the creation of that color a success. So this is the point where I could then redirect the user. So if I were to say use the header function and redirect the user over to the show page, we could certainly do that and exit afterwards. You might remember, though, that the show page that we set up requires that a colors ID be provided. So I have to pass a parameter of ID right here, which is no problem because, of course, we have the ID just there above. We have it stored in last ID. So let me go ahead and append last ID right there, spelled correctly. And when we create a new color, then we can see if we're taken directly to the show page for that color. Let's give it a try. So here on the new page, refreshing it just to make sure everything's working. Let's make another new color. Let's try orange, FF6600. And there we are. Now when the new color is created, we leave the new page. We're redirected back over to the show page, where we can then see the new color that we've actually created. So it's a pretty decent system, the way we have it put together. In the code, of course, the way that's happening is that we, in this head section, when a form has been submitted, here we see that the form has been submitted, right? We then pull the values out of the submitted form data and put them into our variables. We validate that data with a series of if statements here. That, by the way, could probably be turned into a loop at this point with our field names array that we have up above, kind of like we did in the form itself. If we get past validation, which is what this if statement essentially says, if validation succeeds, if there's no errors, then we open the file, read all the colors out of it, and then from all those colors we loop through them and we find the highest ID number. Then we open the file again, this time to append data to it. We then put together the data that we're going to append, which includes that ID number, or one past, one beyond that last ID number. We write that data to the file, we close the file, then, or we tell the user's browser here that we want it to redirect to the show page and give it that particular ID that we've just used. If you think about the header at this point, nothing should have been output. The user requested the form, the user saw the form, the user submitted the form. But when the user submits the form, all of the processing is taking place up here in the PHP, and we actually get to that redirection with the header statement before anything is ever output. We're not back down in the HTML yet, again, on this execution. As a matter of fact, this page at this point is really two pages, could actually be written as two separate pages. One page that was essentially nothing but the form itself, another page that was essentially nothing but the processing that we were doing up at the top. I do find it, though, convenient to have both of those things lumped together here into one page because it makes it much easier for us to be able to pass information back and forth between the sort of the two logical pages, the two logical functions of what this page is doing. Being able to label fields when they have errors and things like that is much simpler when the code that actually validates and finds those errors is on the same page as the actual form itself. One way or another, there's a million different ways that this could potentially be written. This is just sort of, maybe you might say, my style or my particular preference, my opinion of how it might be done. And I'm sure there's still a few little holes in here that might need to be patched up. But in general, I would say at this point we have a working new page and the ability to create colors. So now we can create and we can read. Moving forward, we need to do update and delete.